I'm sure that when you sit down to write a short story, you have a really good reason. You have a reason that story speaks to you and that touches your heart. The trick is to make sure that you get that wow moment across on the page.
Now here's the thing about short stories that nobody really tells you about when you're starting out. Writing a short story isn't any easier than writing a novel. Now don't get me wrong, they're shorter, so finishing a short story is something that almost anyone can do, even if they're having an absolute mare of it. But writing a good, not even great short story is just as hard, if not sometimes harder. If you're writing a novel, you can afford to have a slow chapter. A slow chapter in a short story is the entire thing. A novel gives you the luxury of a few hundred pages to make a reader fall in love with your character. In a short story, you might only have a paragraph. This compression that makes short fiction so satisfying to read is also what makes it so hard to write sometimes. Every sentence has to work harder, every word choice matters more. The opening has to hook immediately, the ending has to land harder, and everything that falls between has to really pull its weight. The writers who do this well, the ones who can tell complete resonant stories in under 5,000 words, have usually thought very carefully about a set of craft principles that are very specific to this form. Not just how to write well, but how to write well in such strict confines. So, I recently spoke to 3 editors here on Reedsy with serious short story credentials, and I asked them for their best piece of advice for new writers of short fiction. And this is what they gave us.
My name is Daniel Waite-Penny. I'm a journalist and an editor. I got most of my editing experience when I was working at the New Yorker magazine. I was working in the fiction department. My main job was handling the unsolicited fiction submissions, what's colloquially known as the slush pile. Do not start your story with your protagonist waking up. It's a technique that allows writers an entry point into the consciousness of their characters, and it's tempting because you get to establish their routine and figure out what everyday life is like for them before the big exciting incident. But it's a cliche and it's run its course. Unless you're Franz Kafka, I highly recommend against it. It's okay to start this way in your first draft, if that's what you need to find your way into your character's mind or into their life. But then I recommend that you cut it before you submit. Have the courage to start with some exposition.
Okay, so if we're not going to show our protagonist waking up in a cold sweat, where do our stories start?
Hi, I am Tracy C. Gold. I am the author of 5 picture books, many essays and short stories that have been published in various outlets, and a freelance editor on Reedsy. Watch out that you're starting at a really integral moment, that you know why the story is starting now, you know why today, why this character, why this moment. And then you can backtrack a little bit into the backstory if you need to. On the flip side, end as early as possible. A lot of the time when I'm editing short stories, I cut off several paragraphs or a page of the ending because the story has a really strong ending moment and we don't need any more.
So, like a skilled burglar, we've identified the right entry point for your story. But once we've cracked the perimeter, what do we do with ourselves? Specifically, how do you know how much detail and specificity to get into your particular story?
Something that I really like to work with my clients who are writing short stories is a balance of scene and summary. You can think of scene and summary as playing with time. When you're showing a scene, you're slowing the time down for the characters and the readers. Those are your really important moments that you want to show exactly what's happening in that moment in the story. Summary is like pressing the fast forward button. We might need to know that something happened, but we don't need to see every detail because you want to hold our attention and keep the story rolling.
So yes, short stories are somewhat of a balancing act, managing scenes and summary, which, come to think of it, is much like balancing showing and telling.
Writers are often told, show, don't tell. This is good advice up to a point, but taken to its extreme, your fiction will begin to resemble a screenplay. Exposition, written with style, is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to quickly establish that this is a writer I should trust, that they have authority, and they know the world that they've created. I encourage writers to think about how they can stylishly and confidently use exposition in their own work. Don't make it an info dump. Think of it as a moment to really kind of show off your prose chops.
On a related note, here's writer, editor, and publisher Angela Yuriko-Smith with something about narrowing your vision.
In real life, we are neurologically wired to hone in and focus on the details that matter. If I came into this room and every single stimulus in this room hit me at once, I would overload and short circuit. I would probably just collapse. It'd be too much input. But as writers, we tend to try to do that in our stories for world building, and especially in a short story, you can't do that. So if your character comes into a room and the texture of the curtains and the smell of the wall, and some of it goes to world building, but if it is so much that I have lost the story, that is too much detail.
This idea of narrowing, zooming in rather than zooming out, is something which distinguishes short fiction from novels, in a structural sense at least. The writers who often struggle with this form tend to be the ones who try to fit a novel's worth of stuff into that tiny amount of short story space. So, everything we've talked about so far, where to start, balancing scene and summary, showing and telling, how closely you zoom in, is all in service of one goal: making the reader care about your character. In a short story, you do have so little time in order to do that. So what do you do?
A lot of times you'll see a rich character, and they wind up being very flat because they just want to be rich. Why? It could be that his mother was an immigrant and she grew up on dirt floors. And so a fear of poverty has been instilled in him. That's why he wants to be rich. And then it makes him a more complicated character where you almost feel sympathetic that he is maybe stealing from widows or children, because you understand that fear that we all have.
At some point in every writer's journey, whether they're writing short stories or novels or screenplays, they're going to get stuck. So, what do you do when you're in that situation?
If you're feeling stuck with a story, change the perspective and try telling it from a different character's point of view. Think about, if you have a charismatic character at the center of your story, instead of writing in their voice, write from the perspective of someone who is drawn into their orbit and see what happens.
Now, there are certain short stories that have stuck in my memory for almost decades now, even though over 20 years ago I may have only spent a few minutes reading them. While there are also novels that I've dedicated more than a week to that I can't remember a single thing about. So what is it about these memorable short stories that made them hit so hard and live so eternally in my brain?
One of the most important things you can do in a short story is make sure you have a wow moment. I'm sure that when you sit down to write a short story, you have a really good reason. You have a reason that story speaks to you and that touches your heart. The trick is to make sure that you get that wow moment across on the page. One of my all-time favorite short stories, The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. It seems like the story is going in chronological order, but when you get to the end, you realize that the characters in the story have a different perception of time, and their child in the story is dead. And you realize as you read that they actually knew that was going to happen, and they could have chosen to not have that child and never suffer that pain. They chose to have that child, even though they knew they would experience that unimaginable pain of losing that child. And when you get to that point, it is just this earth-shaking, amazing moment.
If you're finding this video useful, consider hitting like and subscribe. We put out videos just like this every single week. So everything we've talked about so far has been about the work itself, the craft decisions that end up on the page. But our editors also had a few thoughts they wanted to share about you developing yourself as a writer of short fiction.
If you're chasing what gets published, you're already kind of in the wrong mindset, I would say. Ultimately, the likelihood of getting published in a major magazine is almost zero. So if you're doing it because you think that that's the goal, you're going to have a bad time. The point of writing fiction should be for your own amusement and edification, I think, first, because in all likelihood, this short story is never going to leave your computer.
I see people posting basically what are beautiful short stories on Instagram or Facebook. If you have a great idea and it doesn't fit into what any of these magazines want, if it's a really good story and if it has that wow moment, you can post it anywhere. And there's a chance that it may still find its audience.
The traditional gatekeeping around short fiction, whether that's literary magazines, the prize lists, or submission cycles, those still exist, but they're not the only way to get yourself found. A story that you post online at the right time in the right place has a chance to reach a readership that a literary magazine might not ever. This doesn't mean that one route is better than the other, we're just saying that your options are multiplying, which is always good news for writers. Short fiction is one of the harder things to do in writing, and also one of the more underrated things to get really good at. The discipline it demands will almost certainly carry over to any other form of writing that you want to pursue. After all, if you can hook a reader with one sentence, keep them enthralled for 5,000 words, and leave them with something that resonates, well, then you can do almost anything, baby. If you want editorial feedback on your short fiction from someone who really knows the form, Reedsy has editors who specialize in exactly this, including the ones you've heard from today. Sign up for your free account and you can meet them today. Alright, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more great stuff like this. I've been Martin from Reedsy, and I'll see you on the shelves.